Close your eyes for a moment.
Not completely, not yet. Just let them grow heavy, the way they do on a quiet afternoon when the rain begins against the window and the whole world outside decides, gently and without announcement, slow itself down. You are safe here. Whatever the day brought you, its noise, demands, its flickering brightness, all of it is dissolving now, like ink in still water, spreading outward, fading at the edges, gone. And in its place, something older arrives, something that smells of wood smoke and beeswax and the particular, irreplaceable perfume of very old pages, a scent that has no modern equivalent, manufactured substitute, because it belongs entirely to another time. You are crossing a threshold. The year is somewhere in the 12th century, though the exact number hardly matters here. What matters is the feeling, the low amber warmth pressing out from beneath a heavy oak door, the sound of rain falling in long silver curtains across a cobblestone courtyard, and the knowledge, deep and unhurried, that beyond this door there exists a room unlike any other room in the world. Library. Not a modern library, with its fluorescent hum and plastic chairs. Monastery library. Scriptorium. Place where silence has been carefully cultivated for generations, the way one cultivates a garden, with patience, with intention, with love. Come inside. The door opens, and the night begins. Before we go any deeper into this candlelit world, before we trace the grain of the oak shelves with our fingertips, or lean close enough to read the gilded titles pressed into cracked leather spines, let us pause here, just inside the doorway. The rain continues behind us. It always will. That is one of the most comforting things about rain. It requires nothing of you, it simply falls, and in its falling it creates a curtain between you and everything that felt urgent only an hour ago. Here in this in-between space, with 1 foot still on the wet threshold stone and 1 foot already crossing into warmth, this is the perfect moment to say something quietly. If you find peace in places like this, in slow, lantern-lit journeys through the texture and fragrance of history, then there are many more doors waiting for you on this channel. Each one opens into a different world, a Viking longhouse in deep winter, a candlemaker's workshop in Renaissance Florence, the silk-draped corridors of a Tang dynasty palace at dusk, all of them rendered in the same unhurried language, the same careful, gentle pace that lets you breathe and drift and rest. If that sounds like something you need, and it sounds as though perhaps you do, then consider subscribing. It costs you nothing but a single, quiet tap. And now, with that said softly and sincerely, we step the rest of the way inside. The door closes behind us. The rain becomes a memory. The first thing you notice is the floor. Not the books, not the shelves, not the long amber ribbons of candlelight stretching themselves across the walls like something living and slow. No, the floor, because the floor is the thing that receives you. The floor is the thing your feet meet first, and in a room that has stood for 300 years, the floor carries within its stones all the accumulated weight of every soul who has ever crossed it. These stones are not uniform, they were never meant to be. They are large, irregular slabs of local limestone, the kind quarried from the hillside less than a mile from this very building, hauled by ox cart and set by hand in the early decades of this monastery's life, long before anyone now living had drawn their first breath. Each slab is slightly different from its neighbour. One is pale grey with a faint blush of rose running through it like a thought half remembered. Another is deeper, almost the colour of a winter sea, with tiny fossil shapes pressed into its surface. The ghostly outlines of creatures that lived in warm, shallow oceans before the very concept of a monastery existed, before language, before memory, before the idea of writing anything down. The stones are cold beneath your feet, not unpleasantly cold, not the sharp, biting cold of outdoors, which clings to the rain and travels with it. This is a different kind of cold, a stored cold, the cold of deep earth and deep time. It rises gently through the soles of your feet and travels no further, as though the warmth of the room carried in the candlelight and the faint residual heat of bodies that passed through here only an hour ago holds it in place, keeps it from climbing any higher. And then there is the smell. Oh, the smell of this room. It is not a single smell. It is a conversation between many smells, each one occupying its own register, its own frequency, and together they form something richer than any single note could produce alone. There is the parchment, that dry, animal, faintly sweet smell that comes from pages made of sheepskin and calfskin scraped thin as a whisper and dried in the open air. There is the beeswax of the candles, which is round and golden in the nose, almost edible, almost like honey still warm from the comb. There is the stone itself, which carries a mineral coolness, a breath of the earth, especially on a night like this when the rain drives dampness against the outer walls, and the walls absorb it with the slow patience of something that has absorbed countless rains before. And beneath all of it there is something harder to name, a kind of density, a thickness in the air that is not quite dust and not quite smoke, but is perhaps simply the presence of age. The presence of all those years sitting quietly in the room, unwilling to leave. You are standing just inside the entrance now. The doorway itself is narrow, narrower than you expected. It is framed in dressed stone, the edges worn smooth from generations of hands pressing against them as people lean inward, peering through before deciding to enter. The arch above the door is rounded, Romanesque in its generosity, its curve describing not a sharp, pointed gesture skyward, but a gentle, encompassing embrace, as though the building itself is saying, come in, there is room enough for you here. On either side of the doorway, carved into the stone at approximately shoulder height, are two shallow niches. Each niche holds a small oil lamp, the kind made from a simple clay dish with a wick of twisted wool floating in a pool of rendered fat. The flames in these lamps are very small. They are not meant to illuminate the candles further inside, handle that task. They are meant instead to welcome, to mark the transition, to say to anyone who enters, you are crossing from one world into another, and we have kept a light burning for you. The walls on either side of the entrance are bare stone for the first few feet, unadorned, solid, honest. Then, as you move deeper into the room, the shelving begins. It does not appear all at once. It accumulates gradually, the way a forest accumulates as you walk into it, first one tree, then a few. Then suddenly you realize you are surrounded, that the world has become entirely made of trees, or in this case of shelves. Wooden shelves built directly into the stone alcoves that were designed into the walls when the monastery was first constructed, as though the architect already knew, before a single book had been acquired, that this room would one day be full to its very limits. The shelves are made of oak. You can tell by the grain, that strong, open, slightly silver grain that oak develops when it has been properly seasoned and given time to settle. These shelves have had centuries to settle. They are not the pale, smooth wood of something recently hewn. They are dark with age, with the oils of countless hands running across their surfaces, with the slow absorption of smoke and wax vapor from decades of burning candles. They are a deep amber brown, the color of dark honey or of autumn light through an amber glass, and they are worn at their front edges where the books are most often reached, a smooth, slightly hollowed quality, as if the wood itself has grown polished by want. The ceiling above you, here near the entrance, is low enough to feel intimate, not oppressive, not the closed-in feeling of a too small space, but intimate in the way that a cupped hand feels intimate when it shelters a small flame from the wind. The stones of the ceiling fit together in a barrel vault, each one cut and shaped to carry the weight of the one above it in a continuous, self-supporting arc. Between the individual stones, thin lines of mortar glow faintly in the candlelight, drawing a pale lattice across the vault, a geometry both orderly and organic. And the rain. Even here, even inside, even insulated by 3 feet of stone wall and heavy oak door, the rain continues its conversation with the building. It is not loud, it is the softest possible presence. A murmur, a whisper, an almost sound that you are not entirely sure you're hearing with your ears or feeling with your skin. It is the kind of sound that, once you notice it, becomes not an intrusion but a companion. Gentle, reliable, deeply patient companion that asks nothing of you except that you remain still enough to hear it. You remain still. And in the stillness, the room begins to open itself to you, petal by petal, like something that has been waiting a very long time for someone willing to be quiet enough to deserve it. To understand this room, you must first understand the people who designed it. They were not architects in the modern sense. There was no single drawing board, no set of blueprints rolled out on a flat table under electric light, no computer rendering to test how the afternoon sun would fall through a window at a precise angle on a specific day in March. What they had instead was something older and perhaps more intimate, a tradition, set of principles passed down from hand to hand, from master builder to apprentice, through demonstration and observation, and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge tested against the hard realities of stone and lime and gravity. These principles were not arbitrary. They were deeply, profoundly intentional. The monks who commissioned this building and the craftsmen who built it believed that space itself could be a form of prayer, that the height of a ceiling, the proportion of a window, the way a corridor turned and narrowed before opening into a larger room, all of these things could shape the quality of thought and feeling within a person who moved through them. Space, in this philosophy, was not neutral. Space was active. Space participated. And so the ceiling of this library was made high. Not absurdly, dizzily high, not the soaring vertical ambition of a Gothic nave that makes you feel like an insect at the base of a cliff. This room was built to human proportions, but generous ones. The crown of the central vault rises perhaps 20 feet above the floor at its apex, high enough that the candlelight does not quite reach it. The topmost darkness of the ceiling is soft and deep, like the underside of a cloud. And within that darkness, if you look long enough, you begin to make out the faintest suggestions of colour. Not paint exactly, or not paint applied intentionally as decoration. Rather, the staining of centuries, the slow deposition of candle smoke rising in thin grey columns every night for 300 years, gathering in the highest points of the vault, layering itself in gradations of grey and amber and near black that produce, unexpectedly, a kind of beauty. A beauty that was not planned but accumulated, a beauty that is the pure expression of time. The vault itself is divided into bays, sections separated by ribs of cut stone that spring from corbels set into the walls. These ribs are the bones of the room. Follow one of them with your eye. It rises from its stone corbel at about shoulder height on the wall, curves outward and upward with a movement that is both inevitable and astonishing, reaches the crown of the vault, and joins there with the ribs coming from the opposite wall. The joint at the crown is a small round boss, a carved stone disc, and if you could get close enough to examine it, you would find that each boss in this room is different from the others. One carries a carved rose, its petals worn soft by centuries of air. Another shows a face, bearded, serene, gazing downward with an expression of profound and settled peace. A third depicts a small bird with its wings spread, caught at the precise moment of lifting off from a branch that no longer exists. These carvings were not made to be seen clearly. They were made to be there, made to be placed at the highest, least accessible point of the room where no one would ever examine them closely, where even the monks who spent decades in this library would never truly see them. They were made as the monks who commissioned them understood for God. They were the craftsman's private prayer offered in stone, not a performance of devotion but an act of it, quiet and self-contained, requiring no audience. The windows are set high in the walls above the level of the bookshelves, and they are narrow during the day, and we will speak more of the day in its time, though tonight belongs entirely to the night. These windows would admit long, slanting columns of light that travelled across the room as the sun moved, illuminating first one shelf and then another, though the light itself were reading the books, running its finger slowly along the spines. But tonight the windows show nothing but darkness and rain. Rivulets of water trace irregular paths down the outer surface of the glass, small thick panes of greenish glass set in lead, each one slightly imperfect, each one containing within its substance tiny bubbles and striations where the glassblower's breath became permanent. where the maker left a trace of themselves that they never intended and would never know about. The walls between the windows and below them are thick, genuinely almost incomprehensibly thick by modern standards, in places almost 4 feet from the outer face to the inner surface. This thickness is not merely structural, though it is absolutely structural as well, the weight of the vault and the roof above depending entirely on those massive walls to hold them up and carry that weight down through the courses of dressed stone, down through the rubble core, down through the foundation footings cut into the bedrock of the hill. The thickness is also thermal. The walls act as a vast store of heat, absorbing the warmth of the day slowly and releasing it gradually through the cold of the night, so that this room, even on a November night with rain driving against the outer face, maintains a temperature that is cool but never truly cold. The monks understood this. They built it this way deliberately because cold hands cannot write. Cold hands tremble, and trembling hands cannot form the precise, controlled strokes required to copy a manuscript. In the corners of the room where the walls meet, the stonework is finished with particular care. The corners are not quite square, or rather they are square, but each corner has been chamfered, given a slight angled cut that softens the edge, so that instead of a sharp right angle there is a small diagonal face catching the candlelight from a different direction. These chamfered corners glow faintly, each one its own tiny lantern, and the effect, distributed across the room, is of a gentle omnidirectional warmth, a room where the light seems to come from everywhere and nowhere in particular. The floor, which we noticed when we entered, continues its irregular, honest conversation with the feet, but here in the centre of the room there is one stone that is different from the others. It is larger, nearly a full square yard, and it sits precisely at the geometric centre of the space, where the ribs of the vault converge directly above, into its surface with a craftsman's chisel and evident pride. Someone has cut a simple design, a circle, within which are inscribed 2 intersecting arcs forming the shape known as the vesica piscis, the ancient symbol of sacred intersection of 2 worlds meeting, off the place where the divine and the human briefly, tenderly, breathtakingly touch. You are standing on that stone right now. And the vault breathes above you in the candlelight, and the rain whispers at the windows, and somewhere far above the carved rose and the stone bird and the serene bearded face keep their quiet vigil in the dark. There is a particular quality to candlelight that no other light source has ever quite replicated. Despite centuries of human effort and ingenuity and the best intentions of gas lamp manufacturers and electric bulb designers and the makers of warm spectrum LED bulbs, marketed specifically for their resemblance to something older and more natural, the quality that cannot be replicated is movement. Candle flame is never still. It is in constant, subtle, almost imperceptible motion, a motion governed by the invisible currents of air in the room, by the slow consumption of its own wax, by the minute fluctuations in the draught coming under the door, or through the imperfect seal between stone and lead-framed glass. It bends slightly toward the east when there is no perceptible reason to prefer east. It lengthens and briefly brightens when a current moves past it, then settles again to its baseline, that teardrop of blue at the base, the soft yellow body, the pale orange crown, the thinning thread of heat at the very tip where the flame releases itself into the air, as nothing more than a faint, rising shimmer. And because the flame moves, everything that it illuminates moves with it. This is the alchemy. This is the thing the LED bulb cannot do regardless of how warm its color temperature. When candlelight falls on the surface of an oak shelf, the shadow of each tiny grain in the wood shifts and retreats and returns as the flame breathes. And what you see is not a static surface but a living one, a wood that seems almost to be slowly respiring. When candlelight falls on the surface of a parchment page, the irregularities of the scraped skin, the places where the scraper pressed too hard and thinned the membrane almost to translucence, the places where it left a gentle ridge, all of these become visible and then invisible again in the rhythm of the flame, and the page seems not merely to be lying there, but to be doing something, offering something, trying to communicate. There are 12 candles burning in this room tonight. I know this precisely because 12 is a number with meaning in this place. 12 apostles, 12 hours of the day, 12 months of the year. And the monks who established the lighting protocols for this library did not choose their numbers casually. The candles are distributed across the room with care. 4 on the large central reading table, arranged in a square formation so that anyone sitting at any of the table's 4 sides has at least 2 candle flames within comfortable working distance. 4 more in iron sconces fixed to the walls at regular intervals, each sconce a simple piece of blacksmith's work, a curved bracket ending in a cup to catch the dripping wax, and the remaining 4 placed in taller floor-standing holders near the ends of the longest shelf rows, where the alcoves go deep enough that the wall sconce's light does not adequately penetrate. Each candle is made of beeswax. Not tallow, not the rendered animal fat that produces cheaper, smokier, fishier-smelling light in the dormitories and the kitchens and the outbuildings. Here in the library, only beeswax candles are permitted. The distinction is not merely one of preference or luxury, it is practical and also in a way that feels right for this place philosophical. Beeswax candles burn more cleanly. Their flame is steadier, brighter per unit of size, and their smoke, when they smoke at all, which is rarely if the wick is properly trimmed, rises in a thin, nearly colourless thread rather than the sooty black curl of a tallow candle. Over years and decades, the difference matters enormously. Soot is acid, soot is the enemy of parchment and ink, and the gilded decoration on illuminated pages. A library lit with tallow candles for 50 years would carry 50 years of gradual, insidious damage on every page it contained. Library lit with beeswax carries instead the faintest golden patina, the same enrichment that candlelight provides to an old oil painting, the warm overlay that makes the colours seem deeper and the shadows more intimate. And the smell. We touched on the smell before, that golden, honeyed, round-edged warmth of burning beeswax that permeates the air in this room. But let us stay with it a moment longer, because it deserves the attention. The scent of beeswax is one of those smells that seems to carry within it an entire ecosystem of association. You smell it, and you do not just smell it, but feel it. Feel the warmth it implies, feel the dim indoor coziness of it, feel the faint suggestion of summer meadows and flowering lavender where the bees collected what eventually became this light. It is a smell that makes the body relax at a level below conscious thought. There is something in it that signals in an old animal language that you are safe, that you are warm, that the night outside is no threat to you here. The shadows in this room are the candles' equal partners. Where the candles create islands of amber warmth, the shadows create the architecture of mystery. They pool between the shelves, filling the spaces between books with a soft darkness that is not menacing. Never that, but rather like the darkness between notes in a piece of music, defining, structuring, giving the light its shape. The shadows on the ceiling are the most active, the most dramatic in their movement. Up there near the vault's crown, the 12 candle flames below produce a continually shifting landscape of grey and near black, great soft-edged forms that expand when a candle brightens and contract when it dims, that travel across the stone in slow, dreamlike arcs that follow no pattern you can predict but seem, over the course of a long evening's watching, to develop a kind of intention, a kind of purpose. One particular shadow has attached itself to the corbel nearest the entrance, the carved stone bracket from which one of the wall sconces projects. The corbel itself is carved in the form of a crouching figure, small knees drawn up, head bowed. Probably an angel, they often are. In places like this, the small anonymous attendants at the edges of the sacred. And the shadow of this figure, cast by the sconce flame just above it, falls across the wall and floor below in a shape that is larger than the carving itself, stretched and softened by the distance, so that what arrives on the lower wall is not a sharp silhouette, but a gentle darkness. Tan impression of a presence, a shape that suggests rather than declares, at exactly this hour, the hour you are in right now, late in the evening, rain falling steadily outside, the monastery otherwise quiet. All 12 candles are burning at approximately the same stage of their evening life. They were lit 2 hours ago at Compline, when the monks finished their evening prayers and 2 of their number were assigned the library watch. The candles have consumed perhaps a third of their length. They have found their rhythm. Their flames are steady. not the uncertain fluttering of a newly lit wick not yet fully saturated with wax. They are committed now. They know what they are doing. They are making light. And the light is making this room. And this room is making something in you, some slowing, some settling, some graceful unwinding of the thing that has been wound tight all day. And you stand in the middle of it, the center of the amber and the shadow, and you breathe. Approach the shelves slowly. There is no reason to hurry. The books have been here for a very long time, and they will not move. They have a patience that makes our ordinary human patience look like impatience by comparison. They have been waiting, many of them for decades without being opened, and they will continue to wait for decades more with precisely the same equanimity, the same undemanding stillness. The nearest shelf is at chest height, and the books upon it are arranged in a manner that strikes a modern eye as slightly informal, not lying flat, which is how very fragile volumes are sometimes stored, but standing upright, leaning very slightly against one another. The way people lean together when they are tired and the world has been long. Some have spine labels, small rectangles of parchment glued to their leather covers, inscribed in the precise minuscule hand of a monk who is very probably long dead, the ink still dark and legible, the letters formed with the careful pride of someone who understood that this label was not a convenience for today, but an instruction to the future. The covers of these books are made of wood, thin boards of beech or oak, cut smooth and covered in leather that was once supple and is now dried and cracked at the corners. The way old skin cracks at the knuckles and the joints, the leather was once dyed. You can see this in the protected areas, in the recesses of the blind tool decoration pressed into the cover's surface. There are traces of dark red in the deepest channels of the pattern, the ghost of a colour that was once rich and assertive, and is now nothing more than a whispered suggestion of itself. The outer surfaces of the covers have gone to a deep dark brown that is almost black in the shadowy parts of the shelf, and this darkness is the accumulated contact of hundreds of hands over hundreds of years, the oils of skin rubbed into leather slowly, the way a carpenter's handle becomes darker and smoother than new wood with use. Pick up one of the books, not carelessly with both hands, the way you would carry something irreplaceable, which it is. Feel the weight of it. It is heavier than you expect. Modern books, for all their bulk, are featherweight things by comparison, their paper thin and light, their covers thin cardboard beneath a printed jacket. This book's weight comes from its substance. The wooden boards alone account for much of it, and the parchment pages, there are perhaps 300 of them stacked and folded and sewn together in gatherings called quires. Each parchment page is heavier than paper. It has body, it has presence. You're holding, quite literally, the preserved skin of animals. Perhaps 100 or more calves gave their lives and their hides for this single volume. It is a sobering thought if you allow it to be, and a clarifying one. The people who made these books, and the people who used them, understood the cost. They did not take a single page for granted. Open the book. Not quickly. There is a right speed for opening a very old book, and it is the speed of someone who has all the time in the world, which tonight, in this library, in this rain, you do. The binding is stiff. It resists gently the way a conversation resists if you try to force it toward a conclusion before its natural time. Let the pages find their own level. They open somewhere in the middle, as books do when they are left to their own preference. Their spines remembering the places they were most often opened, the pages most often read, falling there out of habit. The page before you is written in a brown-black ink that is still remarkably legible despite its age. The script is a careful Carolingian minuscule, small, rounded, extraordinarily regular letters formed with a cut quill, the broad face of the nib creating the characteristic thick downstrokes and thin crossstrokes that give this script its elegance, its rhythm, its almost musical quality on the page. The lines are ruled. You can see the faint impression of the ruling lines drawn with a dry stylus into the surface of the parchment before the scribing began, guidelines for the hand to follow, invisible to anyone not looking for them but present and essential, the invisible structure beneath the visible beauty. At the top of the left-hand page, There is a large initial letter, a capital P, the beginning of a paragraph or a new section of text. This P is not simply written, it is inhabited. Within and around it a small figure crouches. A man with a book on his knee, his head slightly bowed as he reads. His robe detailed in a deep blue that has barely faded in 3 centuries. His hair done in the ochre and brown convention of manuscript illustration. His face turned very slightly upward as though he has just looked up from his reading to notice something. A bird outside the window perhaps, or the sound of rain beginning. Around the figure, the artist who painted this initial, working with brushes made from single hairs of a squirrel's tail, dipped in pigments ground from lapis lazuli and malachite and lead white, has filled every available space with a vine. The vine coils and recoils with an energy that seems barely contained by the border of the letter. Its tendrils curling into perfect spirals, each spiral ending in a tiny leaf or a small berry, or, in 2 places, a face, a green face. The ancient green man of pre-Christian tradition made quietly at home within a Christian manuscript, grinning from the foliage with an expression of immense and irrepressible delight, as though he knows perfectly well that he should not be here, and is enormously pleased to be here all the same. The text itself, the words that fill the rest of the page in their orderly brown-black rows, is in Latin. It is a portion of a commentary on the Gospel of John, written by a theologian who lived 3 centuries before the monk who copied it, who lived 2 centuries before you stand here reading it. The ideas on this page were thought first, perhaps in a monastery in Gaul, or on a hillside in North Africa, or in a small stone room in Ireland with a view of a grey Atlantic Sea. They passed through the minds of scholars who discussed and disputed and clarified them. They were eventually written down, and that writing was copied, and the copy was copied, and the copy of the copy was brought to this monastery in a leather satchel on the back of a mule, and a young monk was given the task of reproducing it. And he sat at that very table you can see in the centre of this room, and he dipped his quill in his inkhorn, and he drew the first stroke of the first letter of the first word, and the ideas began their next life. You're reading the end of a very long chain. And you are also, this moment, link in it, because you have looked at these words, and they have passed through your eyes and into your mind, and something of what they carry has joined the long conversation, quietly, without announcement. The candlelit dark. Step away from the shelves for a moment. Come to the window. Not close enough to touch the glass is cold in its lead surround, beaded on its outer surface with rain, and the cold radiates from it in a thin, constant breath that you will feel several inches before your fingertips reach it, but stand here near it. Face the darkness on the other side of those thick, greenish, bubble-filled panes. Watch the rain. Or rather, because you cannot truly see the rain from here, not in this darkness, not without a lantern outside whose light could catch the falling drops and render them visible, listen to it. Let the rain speak to you in the language it has been speaking since long before there was anyone to listen, and simply receive what it is saying. It is saying many things at once. There is the primary voice, the general undifferentiated sound of rain falling on a broad flat surface, which is the sound of rain on the stone path that runs along the exterior of this building. This is the sound you hear most readily, the one your ear reaches for first because it is the most uniform and the most continuous. A soft, complex hiss, a white noise that is not white at all if you listen carefully enough, but is in fact made up of thousands of individual impacts, each one distinct at the microscopic level, each raindrop arriving with its own small report and then spreading itself into the surface it has met, its sound ceasing even as its water joins the thin sheet flowing across the stone toward the drainage channels cut into the path's edges. Below that primary voice there is the water in the drainage channels themselves. These narrow cuts in the limestone path have been there for 2 centuries at least, kept clear by the labours of the monks assigned to the weekly task of outdoor maintenance, and the rain of many previous nights has taught the water exactly how to move through them. It knows its course. It flows with quiet confidence in the channels, finding the slight downward grade, moving toward the corner of the building where the channels converge and pour their combined flow into a larger stone basin, and from the basin over an edge and down into the garden below. The sound this makes is not dramatic. It is not the sound of a waterfall or even a stream. It is smaller, more intimate, the sound of water that knows where it is going, moving purposefully in the dark. Above these ground-level sounds, there is the conversation between the rain and the building's upper surfaces. The roof of this library is leaded, sheets of lead laid over timber rafters and boarding, each sheet carefully overlapped and soldered where they meet, so that not a drop can penetrate, and this roof is one of the monastery's points of genuine pride, maintained with a care that reflects the understanding that what lies beneath it cannot be replaced. The rain falls on this lead roof and speaks there in a slightly different register, a flatter, denser, more metallic sound, less like hissing and more like an even, gentle percussion. If the tile roofs elsewhere in the complex are drums, the lead library roof is a muted bell, struck softly and repeatedly all across its surface simultaneously. And then, most beautiful of all, you have the patience to separate it from the general conversation. There is the water falling from the gargoyles. The gargoyles are not decorative or not primarily decorative, though the sculptor who carved them clearly derived considerable pleasure from the task and allowed himself certain freedoms that a purely functional waterwork would not require. They are drainage spouts, stone channels that carry the rainwater that collects in the roof gutters away from the building's walls and out into the air, so that it falls clear of the foundations and does not, over years and decades, work its way into the mortar and undermine the structure. There are 4 gargoyles on this building, one at each corner, and each one is different. One is a lion or a lion-adjacent creature, since the sculptor had almost certainly never seen a lion, and was working from a description in a bestiary, which is itself a document that blends careful observation with imaginative elaboration in ways that sometimes produce creatures of extraordinary strangeness and charm. Another is an open-mouthed face, human but with long ears, possibly a fool or a scholar, the distinction, in some periods of medieval thought, being negligible. The third is a bird with spread wings. The fourth is too worn to be certain of what it once was, its features dissolved by centuries of the very water it has been directing, an irony that would not be lost on a philosophical monk. From each of these 4 gargoyles right now in this rain, a stream of water is pouring in an arc out into the night air. You cannot see the streams in the darkness, but you can hear them, each one a slightly different voice depending on the volume of water currently flowing through it and the exact distance from the gargoyle's mouth to the ground below. The 2 at the near corners of the building being closer are louder and more distinct, a clear, continuous pour, not quite a rush but more than a trickle, a sound that occupies the middle ground between the 2 and communicates both abundance and control. The far corner gargoyles are softer, filtered by distance, and their sound has a slightly hollow quality, an echo quality that makes them seem both closer and further than they are. Together, all of these water voices compose a piece of music. It is music without a composer or with the most distributed and impersonal of composers. The sky, the stone, the specific topography of this hillside and this building and this night. It has no melody in the conventional sense. No harmonic progression, no development toward a resolution. It simply is, it continues. It will continue after you have fallen asleep, after the candles have burned down, after the monks have risen for their midnight office and returned again to their cells. It was here before you arrived, and it will remain when you are gone. And this continuity, this absolute indifference of the rain to whether it is heard or not, appreciated or not, noticed or not, is, paradoxically, one of the most comforting things about it, because it asks nothing of you. It simply falls, and in its falling creates a boundary, a soft, continuous, self-renewing boundary between you and everything that is not this room, not this warmth, not this amber light, not this sheltered, book-laden, candle-scented, stone-vaulted, wonderfully particular place. You are inside the boundary. The rain is outside it. And the distance between the 2 has never felt more like a gift. Let your shoulders drop an inch. Let your breath come a little more slowly. The rain is still falling. It will be falling for hours yet. You have nothing to do, nowhere to be, nothing to decide or accomplish or understand. You have only to be here, the warm middle of this sound, and let it carry you. To understand the night you're inhabiting, you must first understand the day that preceded it. The monks who live and work in this monastery do not experience time the way you experience it, not as a continuous, undifferentiated flow from morning to evening, measured by a clock face and subdivided by appointments. They experience it as a sequence of fixed, recurring moments, each one given a name, each one marked by the ringing of a bell, each one requiring a specific action of body and spirit. This structure is not a cage. The monks who have lived within it for years and decades do not experience it as a cage. They experience it as a skeleton, the thing that gives the body its shape, that allows it to stand upright and move through the world without collapsing into a formless heap. The day begins before the sun has any notion of rising. At around 2 in the morning. The exact time varies with the season, since the canonical hours are calibrated to the movements of the sun rather than to an arbitrary fixed point. The bell rings for vigils, also called matins. This is the night office, the longest and in many ways the most mysterious of the day's 7 prayer times. The monks rise from their straw pallets in the dormitory, a long cold room above the cloister walk, and they do this in complete darkness because fire and light are not wasted here except where genuinely needed. They dress by feel, each man knowing the arrangement of his own clothing as a carpenter knows the arrangement of his tools. They file in silence down the night stairs into the church, and in the church, which is lit by a single lamp before the altar, they take their places in the choir stalls, carved wooden seats, each one with a hinged misericord beneath it that can be tipped up to provide a small ledge to lean against during the long-standing portions of the office, a mercy seat, a compassionate accommodation for aging knees and the inevitable weaknesses of the human body. They sing. Not performatively, not for any audience, not for beauty, though beauty arrives anyway the way it always does when something is done with genuine attention and care. They sing the psalms, 150 of them distributed across the week, each psalm appointed to its particular hour and day by a schedule worked out by St. Benedict himself 6 centuries ago and refined by generations of abbots since. Their voices in the cold, lamplit church create a sound that has no real modern analogue. Plain chant that rises and falls not in the intervals of a melody composed by an individual imagination, but in the ancient modal patterns that feel as though they grew from the stones and the air, and the particular human impulse to address something larger than oneself. After vigils, there is a period of private reading and meditation before the next office. Lauds at dawn, then prime at the 1st hour of the day, then terce at the 3rd hour, sext at the 6th hour, noon, when the bell calls the monks from whatever they have been doing to stand briefly in their places and offer the midday praise, none, at the 9th hour in the middle of the afternoon, vespers in the evening as the light begins to fail, and finally complin, the completion, the last office of the day, which ends with the Salve Regina, a prayer to the Virgin sung in the deepening dark of the church, and after which the great silence descends, the rule of quiet that will not be broken except in emergency until after vigils the following morning. Between the offices, the day is divided into work. Tora et labora, pray and work. The Benedictine motto is not a paradox, it is a unified vision of the human life as a thing that must be active in both dimensions simultaneously, neither retreating entirely into the interior nor losing itself entirely in the exterior. The monks work in the garden, growing the vegetables and herbs that supplement their diet. They work in the bakehouse, in the brew house, in the infirmary. They work in the cloister walk, copying letters and maintaining the administrative records of the monastery's landholdings and agreements with the surrounding villages and the distant hierarchy of the church. And some of them, the most learned, the most gifted in their hands, simply those whose temperament suits the work, come here, this library, this scriptorium that occupies the eastern end of the long room, to copy manuscripts. On a typical day, a senior monk arrives at the scriptorium shortly after prime and remains until terce. He returns after the brief break for chapter meeting, the daily gathering in the chapter house where the abbot reads a portion of the rule and the community addresses its practical business and works again until sext. The afternoon session after the midday rest that follows the main meal runs from none until vespers. In summer, this schedule might yield 6 or 7 hours of actual writing time. In winter, when the light through the high windows is thin and short-lived and candles must be conserved, it might yield 4. Over a career of 30 years in the scriptorium, a dedicated monk might produce 20 or 30 major volumes, each one a year's work or more, a year of his eyes and his wrists and his deep, quiet attention pressed into leather and parchment and left behind for a future he would never see. They eat once a day in the height of winter, a single meal of bread and cooked vegetables and beans, taken in the refectory in silence, while a reader appointed for the week reads aloud from a devotional text. In summer, a second lighter meal is permitted. Meat is rare, reserved for feast days and the infirmary, where the sick are given what the healthy must forego. This is not privation in the spirit in which the modern world understands privation. It is rather a deliberate arrangement of physical life in the service of mental and spiritual clarity, the understanding that a body lightly fed is more alert than a body heavily fed, that the senses sharpen when they are not dulled by excess, that the mind reaches further when it is not occupied with digestion. Tonight, all of that long day is behind the monk who sits at the reading table across the room from you. He arrived here after Compline with permission to remain in the library during the Great Silence, an unusual permission granted only for pressing work, and the work is pressing. Calendar for the coming year that must be completed and distributed to the daughter houses before the Advent season begins. He works now in the quiet that follows the last bell, in the warmth of his beeswax candles, surrounded by the shelves and the rain and the thick, steady, ancient peace of a room that has absorbed centuries of exactly this: a person, a candle, a page, and the unhurried commitment to do the work well. His name, let us say, Brother Edmund. He has been here 34 years. He does not look up as you enter. He does not need to. He already knows, some deep and untroubled way, that you are here, that someone from somewhere very distant in time, standing in this room, looking at the shelves, listening to the rain, finding in this place the same quiet that he has found here every evening for 3 decades. He keeps writing. The quill moves across the page in small, precise strokes. The rain falls. The candles burn. Come closer to the table where Brother Edmund works. Not so close as to disturb him, he is in the deep, concentrated quiet that skilled craftsmen of all kinds enter when their work is going well, a state that resembles sleep in its stillness but is its precise opposite in its attention, an active inner life entirely focused on the task at hand, but close enough to see what he is doing, close enough to observe in detail the specific gestures and tools and materials that constitute the act of manuscript writing in this century, in this place, on this particular rainy night. The table at which he sits is solid, heavy, undecorated. Its top is a single plank of oak aged to the same dark amber as the shelves, its surface worn smooth and slightly cupped in the area where most work is done, directly in front of the writer, slightly left of centre for a right-handed scribe, where hundreds of forearms have rested over the years. The slow pressure of human contact, shaping the wood as slowly and as certainly as a river shapes a stone. The plank is inclined at an angle. One edge is raised perhaps 3 inches higher than the other by a wedge of wood placed beneath it, because the medieval scribes understood that writing on a vertical or near-vertical surface produces better letter forms than writing on a flat one. When you write on an angle, the wrist moves differently, the ink flows more consistently from the quill, and the eye can assess the letters more accurately because the written surface faces you rather than lying away from you. Brother Edmund's writing equipment is arranged to his left within easy reach. There is an inkhorn, a small horn from a cow or ox, the pointed end plugged with a wooden stopper, the open wide end sitting in a hole cut into a small wooden block that serves as a holder, keeping it upright and stable. The ink inside is dark, brown-black in the bottle, appearing almost entirely black on the page. It is a gall ink made from oak galls, the small round growths that oak trees produce in response to the egg-laying of certain wasps, chemical factories of the natural world, rich in tannins that react with iron salts dissolved in rainwater or vinegar to produce a substance that adheres tenaciously to parchment, penetrating its surface rather than merely sitting on it, and that will remain legible for centuries or millennia if the parchment itself survives. Beside the inkhorn sits a small ceramic pot containing a secondary ink, a deep red made from vermilion, which is mercuric sulfide ground to a fine powder. This is the rubric ink, used for headings, for the capital letters at the beginning of new sections, for the small red dots used as punctuation marks to indicate pauses and full stops. The word rubric itself contains this colour. It comes from the Latin rubricare, to mark in red, and the practice of using red for emphasis and hierarchy in written documents is so ancient and so persistent that it survived the transition from manuscripts to printed books and lives on vestigially in the language of law and liturgy. He is holding a quill. Not just any feather plucked at random from the monastery's gooseyard, though geese are indeed the primary source of scribal quills, their large wing feathers providing the combination of size, strength and flexibility that the work requires. This quill has been prepared with considerable care. The feathers' barbs, the soft, wispy parts of the vane, have been stripped away from the lower section of the shaft, so that the working end is clean and unobstructed. The tip of the shaft has been cut to shape with a small, very sharp knife called a penknife, the penknife, whose name preserves within it this specific function even now when such knives have long since forgotten their origin. The cut tip forms a split nib, two equal points separated by a fine slit, the slit functioning as a capillary that holds a small reservoir of ink between the 2 points and releases it in a controlled metered flow as the nib moves across the surface. The specific shape of the nib cut determines the specific quality of the letters produced. Brother Edmund has cut his nib wide and at a specific oblique angle because the script he is writing, a formal book hand called Caroline minuscule, requires thick downstrokes and thin upstrokes, a characteristic that can only be produced by a nib with a broad, obliquely cut edge meeting the surface at precisely the right angle. He has worked out this angle over decades of practice until it is no longer a calculation but a posture, a habit of the hand so deeply ingrained that he could produce it in his sleep. He dips the quill into the inkhorn. Not deeply, just the tip, to load the reservoir without flooding it. Then he withdraws it, pauses for a fraction of a second in which you can see, if you look closely, a tiny bead of dark ink gathering at the slit in the nib, held there by surface tension, waiting. He positions the nib at the beginning of a new line. You can see the faint ruling line drawn there in dry stylus, a guideline invisible except in raking light, and he begins to write. The strokes come in a sequence that has its own rhythm, its own internal music. The broad downstroke, firm, deliberate, the nib held at its oblique angle, the full width of the cut face meeting the parchment and releasing its ink in a strong, confident line. Then the thin connecting stroke, the nib rotating very slightly, the narrower edge now making contact, producing a hairline that curves up to meet the next downstroke. Letter by letter, the words accumulate with a steadiness that is both mechanical and deeply personal. The precision of trained craft expressing itself through the particulars of one man's hands, one man's rhythm, one man's way of holding the world at bay long enough to get the words right. There is a pumice stone near his right hand. He uses it occasionally to smooth a rough patch in the parchment surface before writing over it, the small abrasive correction taking perhaps 2 seconds, accomplished without pause or frustration. Protestantes, a carpenter might automatically plane a small roughness without interrupting the larger flow of the work. There is also a small pot of whitish substance, white lead mixed with a binding medium, with a very fine brush beside it, for correcting errors, dab of white over the mistake, let it dry, then rewrite. The correction will be visible to anyone looking closely enough. a small bright patch in the aged surface of the page, but it will not be considered a failure. The standards of manuscript production are high, but they are human standards, and humans correct their errors rather than wasting an entire page over them. Every hour or so, the stops. He sets down his quill, lays it carefully across the top of the inkhorn. He stretches his fingers. You can see the deliberate, slow extension of each one, the spreading of the hand, the rotation of the wrist. The hands of a professional scribe are under extraordinary muscular strain during long sessions of work. The fine motor muscles of the fingers and the extensor and flexor muscles of the wrist performing precise repetitive movements for hours at a stretch. The stretching is not casual. It is prophylactic, the monk knows, from experience and from the experience of his predecessors, that the hands must be tended as carefully as the tools. Then he flexes his shoulders, breathes, looks up briefly, not at anything in particular, his gaze passing over the shelves, over the candle flames, perhaps over the spot where you are standing, and then returns to the page. Dips the quill. Begins again. On the far side of the scriptorium table, beyond Brother Edmund's working area, the surface changes character. This section of the table belongs to the illuminator, Brother Anselm, who is not here tonight, who has gone to his cell with the rest of the community after Compline, but whose tools and materials remain arranged on the table with the methodical tidiness of someone who knows he will return to them tomorrow morning and will want to find them exactly as he left them. His absence gives us an opportunity to examine his materials in detail, unhurried, the candlelight generous and steady over the rows of small ceramic pots and the flat grinding stones, and the tiny brushes made from hairs finer than anything you would recognize as a brush if you saw it without knowing what it was for. The pigments. This is where colour comes from in this century, in this place. There are no synthetic paints, no manufactured colours produced in industrial quantities and sold in standardized tubes. Every colour on every illuminated page in every manuscript in this library began as a substance, a mineral, an earth, a plant, a shell, an insect that was collected, processed, ground and mixed with a binding medium to produce something that could be applied to a surface with a brush and would, once dry, stay there. Let us go through them. The blue, the extraordinary, irreplaceable blue that defines the finest manuscripts of this period, and that, when you see it, even across the distance of centuries and through the patina of age, makes something happen in the chest, a small expansion, an intake of breath, physical response to a colour that seems not quite natural, not quite of this world. This is lapis lazuli, and it comes from Afghanistan, specifically from mines in the region called Badakhshan, in the high mountains where the stone forms as veins of intense blue within pale host rock, a blue so saturated and so deep that the unprocessed rock, freshly broken, seems almost to glow from within. The stone was transported westward along the trade routes, the same routes that carried silk and spices and ivory and ideas, passing through Persia, through the Arab world, through Byzantium, arriving eventually in Italy and France and England and Germany at enormous expense. The price of this blue per unit of weight comparable to the price of gold because it had travelled so far and because the process of extracting the pure pigment from the stone was so laborious. The process, the raw lapis, is ground to a coarse powder. The powder is kneaded with a mixture of wax, oils and resins until it forms a dough. This dough is then kneaded in water, slowly, repeatedly, patiently, and the pure ultramarine pigment, being heavier than the impurities, sinks first and can be collected. The first water yields the finest, most intensely blue pigment, the true ultramarine, the one that commands the highest price and is reserved for the most important passages of the most important manuscripts, the Virgin's robe, the dome of heaven, the wings of the most senior angels. Subsequent kneadings yield progressively paler, greyer blues used for less exalted purposes. The final residue, barely blue at all, is the most ordinary grade, used perhaps for backgrounds or for the underpaint beneath a stronger colour. Next to the lapis pots sit the green pigments. There are two, verdigris, which is the green patina that forms on copper when it is exposed to acetic acid, to vinegar, and which the monks produce by suspending sheets of copper over vessels of fermenting grape marc, then scraping the green deposit from the metal surface after it has accumulated. It is a vivid, sharp, slightly acid green, unstable in the long term. It tends to corrode parchment if applied too thickly, eating slowly through the skin over centuries. But in the short term, in the hands of a skilled illuminator who applies it in thin, transparent layers, produces a green of startling freshness, a green that looks as though it was just made this morning from new grass and early rain. The other green is malachite, a mineral related to azurite, ground to a powder that is warmer and somewhat earthier than verdigris, used where the composition requires a green that settles rather than advances. The red family, vermilion for the bright, warm, slightly orange-red of headings and borders, red lead, minium from which the word miniature derives, since early miniaturists working in small scale used it extensively, for a slightly cooler, more orange-red used in decorative work, and madder lake, extracted from the roots of the madder plant through a long process of boiling and precipitation, for a deeper, more crimson red that approximates the colour of old blood or certain kinds of rose used in shadows and in flesh tones when the composition requires skin. Yellow orpiment, which is arsenic trisulfide, a bright, warm, lemony yellow found as a natural mineral, and also manufactured artificially. It is poisonous, the monks know this, and Brother Anselm handles it with a care that the other pigments do not require, never putting the loaded brush to his lips to form a point as scribes and illuminators reflexively do with their other brushes. Lead white for whites, and for mixing with other colours to produce the full range of tones, highlights in flesh, clouds in sky backgrounds, the white of an angel's garment, bone black, calcined bone, ground to a fine powder of absolute, light-absorbing darkness, for outlines and for shadows. Each of these pigments must be mixed with a binding medium before it can be used. The medium here is glare, beaten egg white, whipped to a stiff foam and then left to collapse back into a liquid, which is then decanted and strained through a cloth. Glare is one of the oldest binding media for illumination, and it has properties that make it peculiarly suited to the work. It dries to a slight sheen without the high gloss of varnish. It is flexible without being tacky. It allows the pigments to be applied in thin, translucent layers that can be built up gradually, each layer dry before the next is added, producing a luminosity, a sense of light coming from beneath the surface rather than sitting on top of it. That is one of the defining visual qualities of the finest medieval illumination. Brother Anselm's brushes range from a crow-quill pen used for the finest outlines, a single squirrel tail hair giving a line of extraordinary delicacy, to a slightly broader brush used for laying in areas of flat colour. They sit in a small cup of water to keep them from drying stiff, and in the candlelight the water in this cup has caught a reflection of the nearest flame and holds it, a miniature fire floating in a miniature pool, the whole thing smaller than your thumbnail, burning and burning without consuming itself, a tiny miracle of reflected light sitting quietly among the pigments and the parchment and the rain. There is one manuscript on the table that is not Brother Anselm's current project. It is a completed book placed here for reference, its pages open to a full illuminated folio, a complete page given over entirely to decoration, with no written text at all, only image and colour and gold. The abbot brought it from the upper shelf this morning so that Brother Anselm could study the way a previous illuminator, working in this same scriptorium perhaps 80 years ago, had solved a particular compositional problem involving the arrangement of figures within an architectural frame. The book now rests open at this page, and the page in the candlelight of this rainy evening is perhaps the most beautiful thing in this beautiful room. It is a full-page miniature depicting the Annunciation. The Virgin sits at the left of the composition in a room of stylized architecture, columns and arches indicated in thin lines of deep red and gold that suggest grandeur without attempting to describe it literally. Her robe is blue, that blue. The lapis lazuli blue, the first water extraction, ground fine and applied in multiple layers over an underdrawing in lead white. Each layer slightly different in tone, the deepest shadows made with a touch of black added to the blue. The highlights, the raised folds of the robe catching the light, executed in pure lead white applied last over the dry blue in small deliberate dabs that create the impression of light falling from a source to the upper left. She is reading. This is a detail that does not appear in all versions of this scene, but appears in many, particularly from this period and region, and it is a detail of considerable significance. The Virgin is reading a book when the angel arrives, and the book she is reading is generally understood to be the book of Isaiah, in which the prophecy of her own role is already written. She is, in other words, reading her own story in a book written centuries before her birth, a thought that is either circular in a dizzying way or perfectly logical depending on your metaphysical commitments. The book in her hands is rendered with a precision that suggests the illuminator had strong feelings about books. Its cover is tooled leather, its pages are visible at the foredge, and though it is only perhaps a centimetre wide on the finished page, you can count the individually painted page edges. The angel Gabriel enters from the right. He is larger than the architectural space logically permits, because the illuminator was working in a tradition that understood scale not in terms of spatial realism but in terms of spiritual hierarchy. Important figures are large, less important figures are smaller, and the physical laws of perspective are simply not the operating system being used. Gabriel's wings are extraordinary, each feather individually painted, the quills white, the veins shifting from white at the top through warm gold at the midpoint to the deep, almost peacock blue-green of lapis at the tips. His robe is a deep ochre gold, and his expression is one of such profound and compassionate seriousness that it has the quality of something felt rather than observed, a face that was not copied from life, since angels are not available to sit for portraits, but was felt inward and then expressed outward, passing through the illuminator's interior life on its way from idea to image. Between the two figures, the exact centre of the composition, is the gold. The gold of medieval manuscript illumination is not paint. This is the essential thing to understand. It is not gold-coloured pigment, not yellow mixed to approximate gold, not gold ink of the type produced by grinding metallic powder into a binding medium. It is gold, actual gold, the very same element that was extracted from ore in some far mine, refined and hammered into sheets of extraordinary thinness, thinner than a soap bubble almost, called gold leaf, and applied to the parchment surface using a technique that requires patience, dryness, precise atmospheric conditions, and the kind of focused attention that cannot be rushed. First, the area to be gilded is painted with a layer of gesso, a preparation made from chalk and lead white and fish glue, mixed and cooked to a specific consistency, and applied in careful layers that build up a slightly raised, slightly cushioned surface. This raised surface is critical. The height allows the gold leaf to catch light from multiple angles simultaneously, creating the sense of inner luminosity that distinguishes true raised gilding from flat applications. The gesso is allowed to dry completely, then burnished smooth with a tooth of a carnivore, a wolf's tooth typically set in a handle, until the surface is as smooth as glass and as slightly warm as skin. Then the illuminator breathes on the gesso very gently. The warmth and moisture of his breath reactivates the animal glue in the surface just enough to make it sticky. Then, with a speed and sureness that comes from practice, the gold leaf, held on a piece of velvet because static electricity is the leaf's ally and the leaf's enemy simultaneously, is laid over the gesso and pressed down with a soft, dry brush. The leaf clings, most of it. Excess is removed with a breath, and the remaining gold sits over the raised gesso, covering it perfectly. A surface that is at once absolutely flat and constantly moving, because it is real gold, and real gold reflects everything in its vicinity, the candle flames, the illuminator's own face, the blue of the robe it is meant to illuminate, the pale skin of the parchment at its edges. Then it is burnished again. The wolf's tooth, or sometimes an agate or a hematite stone set in a handle, is moved in smooth, deliberate strokes over the gold surface, pressing it more firmly into its gesso bed, compressing it, and with each stroke the gold becomes brighter. Not the matted brightness of initial application, but a true mirror brightness, a reflectivity so complete that when you hold the page at a certain angle, the gold is not gold-coloured but is simply a window, a hole in the page where the light comes from inside. In the Annunciation miniature before you, the gold covers the architectural arches and the halos of both figures, and the space between them that represents heaven's light entering the world. When you move the manuscript slightly, tipping it, rotating it, the gold shifts and flares and dims and flares again, and the whole composition breathes, and the Virgin looks up from her reading, and Gabriel's wings catch the light. Tanned for a moment, the thing that the illuminator was attempting to do, to make visible on a flat page something that is not flat, not made of pigment, not of this world at all, almost succeeds. It almost succeeds. And in that reaching gesture of craft and faith and concentrated human attention, there is something that transcends the specific century and the specific religious context, and arrives at a place that is simply human, simply the reaching, simply the attempt to express what cannot quite be expressed, simply the old practice of putting your best effort onto a surface and hoping that someone, somewhere, sometime will hold it in the right light and understand what you were trying to say. You understand. You are standing here in the candlelight, train on the windows. Tan, do you understand? The great silence has been in effect for over an hour now. It descended at the end of Compline like something physical, not the absence of sound, which is how silence is sometimes described, but the presence of something, a quality added to the air, a texture. The monks who have lived here for years feel it as a kind of relief, the way a held breath is relieved by its own release. The day's necessary speech, the liturgy, the reading in chapter, the brief exchanges of practical information that monastic life requires, all of it concluded. All of it laid down, and in its place this other thing, this cultivated, tended, deeply inhabited quiet. But the silence is not empty. Silence never is, when you attend to it carefully enough. In this room, on this night, the silence is full of sounds that silence alone can reveal, sounds that exist at all times but are audible only when the louder things are removed. Let us move through them slowly, the way you might move through a darkened room with your hand extended, finding the shapes that were always there but invisible. First, your own breath. You have been breathing since you entered this room, and you will breathe until you leave it, and between now and then your breath is the closest, most personal, most intimate sound in this place. In the silence it becomes audible in a way it usually is not, the slight sound of air entering through the nose, the small warmth of it against the upper lip as it exits, the faint rhythm of chest and ribs, the way the pace of your breathing has, without your noticing, slowed significantly since you sat down here by the reading table, as the body follows the mind's lead, as the mind follows the room's. Second, the candle flames. They are nearly silent. Nearly. If you are very close to one and the room is very quiet, there is the faintest sound of combustion, a barely perceptible whisper, more felt than heard, a vibration that registers not quite in the ear but somewhere adjacent to it, and occasionally when a small impurity in the wax passes through the wick, or when the wick itself needs trimming, there is a tiny crackle, a small voice, brief and soft, like the sound of a word spoken by someone who immediately thinks better of it and stops. Third, the building. Old stone buildings speak, not dramatically, not the groaning and creaking of Gothic horror stories which take a legitimate acoustic truth and amplify it into theatre. The truth is subtler and more interesting. The timbers of the roof, the large oaks that span from wall to wall above the vaulted ceiling, expand and contract with changes in temperature and humidity. At night, as the air cools, they contract very slightly, and this contraction is occasionally accompanied by a sound, a single tick, sharp and clean, like someone snapping their fingers at a great distance. It comes irregularly, you cannot predict it, and this irregularity is part of its charm. It is the building adjusting, the building breathing, the building doing what all old buildings do in the night, which is to settle a little more deeply into its. The stone itself makes a sound too, but this one is below the threshold of hearing. It is a vibration rather than a sound, felt through the floor if you're standing still enough, a slow, deep, almost geological pulse that might be the expansion of stone cooling from the day's residual warmth, might be the movement of groundwater in the hill below the foundations, or might simply be the planet turning on its axis, the vast ordinary rotation of the Earth expressing itself as a faint tremor in the limestone floors of a monastery library on a rainy Wednesday in the 12th century.
Fourth, the rain.
We have described the rain already and will return to it, because it is the room's constant companion and it speaks in many registers, but within the silence its quality changes. When there is ambient human noise, voices, footsteps, the soft scrape of quill on parchment, the rain is a background to those sounds. In the silence, it becomes the foreground. It becomes unexpectedly company. The same rain that you might find relentless or melancholy in another context becomes, in this cultivated quiet, a reliable and friendly presence, something that keeps you from feeling alone without demanding anything of you. Fifth, Brother Edmund's quill. From across the room it is barely audible, but the scrape of a sharp quill on quality parchment is a distinctive sound, a small controlled hiss, slightly raspier than the hiss of a pencil on paper, but with the same fundamental quality of material meeting material in controlled opposition. He works in a slow, steady rhythm. Stroke, pause, dip, stroke, pause, stroke. The rhythm of it, once your ear finds it, is genuinely soothing, a small, distant, regular sound that gives the silence a structure, the way a heartbeat gives the body of silence in a sleeping room a structure. Sixth, and most elusive, the sound of the books. This requires significant stillness to perceive. It is not a sound in the ordinary sense, but more of a presence, the faint olfactory adjacent quality of very old parchment and leather and oak in a room that has contained these materials for centuries. It is technically not a sound at all, and yet in a silence deep enough it registers in a way that resembles sound, or resembles the sensation of being listened to, which is perhaps the same thing. The books, in their deep quiet, seem to exert a kind of pressure on the air that is almost auditory, a density, a fullness, a sense of all those recorded words existing just at the threshold of utterance, not quite speaking, but not quite not speaking either. In the monastic tradition, silence is not the absence of the word, but its fullness. The logic goes, ordinary speech is a small, partial, imperfect attempt to express what language was made to express. Silence, in this tradition, is not a failure of speech, but a recognition that the deepest things cannot be said in ordinary speech, that they require another medium, a receptive one rather than a transmissive one. You do not transmit the deepest things, you make space for them, and then you wait. The monks of this place have been making this argument, not in words, but in practice, in the daily repetition of chosen silence for over a century. The argument is pressed into the stones and the shelves and the parchment and the beeswax and the accumulated layers of candle smoke on the highest vault. It is the room's thesis. And sitting here, in the middle of it, in the middle of the silence and the rain and the amber light, and the deep, patient, undemanding presence of all these preserved words, you feel it, not as a theological proposition, as a physical fact. The silence holds you. You are perfectly, completely safe within it. It comes without warning, the way true things often do. The bell. Not a violent sound. Nothing about this bell is violent. It is a large bronze bell hung in the tower above the crossing of the church, and it was cast 3 generations ago by a bell founder whose name is not recorded anywhere, which is one of the small tragedies of a world where records were kept selectively and craftsmen were often considered less worthy of commemoration than the institutions they served. But the bell itself is his monument. The bell is his signature, pressed in bronze into time, and every time it rings, which it will continue to do for centuries after this night, after these monks, after the very language they pray in has shifted and changed beyond recognition. It says quietly and irrefutably, I was here, I made this, it endures. The bell rings for vigils. It is somewhere in the small hours, the exact time difficult to determine without a mechanical clock, which does not yet exist. The bell ringer having woken himself by a combination of practice, training, and the kind of internal timekeeping that develops in anyone who performs the same action at the same hour for years. He rises, lights a small lamp, climbs the steps to the bell chamber, takes the rope in both hands, and begins. The first toll seems to come from everywhere at once. The stone walls of this library do not dampen it but transmit it. The vibration moving through the masonry as a physical thing, a tremor felt in the sternum before it is heard in the ear. The sound is deep and round and long. A bell tone has a complexity that a single frequency cannot describe. It contains within itself a fundamental note, and above that a series of overtones at different frequencies that decay at different rates, so that what you hear is not one sound but a slowly changing chord. The higher overtones fading first and leaving the deep fundamental to roll out through the building and into the wet night air, and across the monastery's vegetable garden and down the hillside to the village below, where sleeping families hear it in their dreams and are not disturbed. The bell is so familiar, so thoroughly absorbed into the acoustic landscape of their lives, that it enters their sleep as a known thing, a safe thing, a sound that says only time is passing and all is well. In the dormitory above the cloister, the monks are rising. Brother Edmund, here at the table, sets down his quill. He caps the inkhorn with practised precision. He folds his arms for a moment, not in prayer yet that will come, but in a brief, complete pause, a full stop in the sentence of the night's work. Then he rises from his bench, and in rising he straightens very slowly, the way a man straightens after long-seated work when his back has stiffened and his knees have grown accustomed to their folded position. And there is something in this rising that is both humble and dignified, the body acknowledging its own limitations and then, immediately and without complaint, doing what is required of it. He lifts his copy of the Divine Office from the corner of the table where it has been waiting all evening with the patience of books. Always waiting, books always ready, never impatient, and he tucks it under his arm. And he crosses the library floor toward the door, his soft leather shoes making almost no sound on the stone. He pauses at the door, he turns back, once, and looks at the table, at the work in progress, at the half-completed calendar page, at the arrangement of pens and inks and parchment that will remain here until morning. He looks at it the way you look at something you're leaving temporarily, acknowledging it, assuring it, and yourself, of your return. Then he opens the door, and the cold air of the cloister walk comes in, a brief intrusion, the smell of rain and stone, and the particular smell of the cloister, which is slightly different from the library, slightly more mineral, the permanent slight chill of a corridor open to the sky, and he passes through it, and the door closes, and he is gone. And the library is alone. Well, not quite alone. You are here. And the books are here. And the candles continue their slow, faithful burning, their flames swaying slightly in the air, disturbed by the opening and closing of the door, then settling again, then utterly still. Outside, through the thick walls, you can hear, or imagine you can hear, the sound of the monks moving through the cloister, sandals and soft shoes on wet stone, the hushed collective movement of 18 men crossing from dormitory to church in the middle of the night, in the rain, in the cold, sing psalms that most of them have known by heart for years, that their predecessors knew by heart, that their successors will know by heart, the psalms themselves the most enduring artifact in this world of manuscripts and carved stone and bronze bells, the words older than any building, older than any institution, travelling down through time in the mouths and memories of people who have found in them, generation after generation, something that addresses itself to the deepest level of human experience. The church receives them. The door of the church closes. And from across the wet courtyard, through the stone walls of the library, muffled by distance and rain and masonry, the first notes of the night office begin. The chant is barely audible here. It is a murmur at this distance, the barest suggestion of pitched sound coming from the direction of the church, arriving in the library as a kind of overtone, the way you can sometimes hear music from far away and are not quite sure whether you're hearing it or remembering it, but it is there. If you go very still, stiller than still, quiet in your breathing, quiet in your thoughts, open to the room and it sounds in the way that the room seems designed to encourage you to be, you can hear it. Low voices moving together in the slow, unhurried interval of plainsong, not performing, not projecting, addressing in the intimate second person of the Psalms the thing that all prayer ultimately addresses, the presence that these men believe inhabits their silence the way warmth inhabits a stone that has been in the sun. The sound travels through the wet November air and through the feet of stone between church and library, and into this room, and it joins the rain and the candles and the deep smell of the books. And, together, these things make something. Something that does not have a modern name. Something that is nevertheless extremely old. And in the library, the amber silence. The books hold their pages very still. Not all of the manuscripts in this library are devoted to scripture and its interpretation. The third shelf from the floor on the north wall, the long wall that runs along the full length of the room, the wall furthest from the windows and therefore the darkest where the books least often consulted live their patient, unread lives, contains a section devoted to practical knowledge. These volumes do not have the gleaming illuminations of the liturgical books. Their decoration is functional rather than devotional. Diagrams, outlines, carefully labelled drawings that were made not for beauty, but for identification. These are the herbals. The herbarium of this monastery, the physical garden that these books describe, lies outside in the sheltered angle between the east wall of the church and the south wall of the infirmary. Even on a night like this, even in November in the rain, it exists. The low box hedges that divide it into sections, the bare winter stems of the plants that will return in spring, the small stone markers with their incised names, the smell of wet earth and the lingering ghost scent of last summer's lavender and mint and rosemary that clings even now to the dormant plants, released in a faint, herbaceous whisper by the rain. The books on this shelf are the mental image of that garden, the accumulated knowledge of what grows there, what it can do, how it is to be prepared and administered, what conditions it relieves and what conditions it should be avoided in. This knowledge did not begin here. It travelled to this library from ancient sources, from Dioscorides, the Greek physician of the 1st century who described and catalogued over 500 medicinal plants in his Materia Medica, work copied and recopied through Byzantine scholarship and Arabic translation, and eventual return to the Latin West from Pliny the Elder, whose vast encyclopedia of natural history included extensive material on plant-based remedies, from Galen, the towering physician theorist whose understanding of the body's 4 humours and their relationship to health and disease would remain the dominant medical model for another 5 centuries. But it did not arrive here unchanged. Each monastery through which this knowledge passed left its own edition. A monk in a scriptorium in Ireland, reading the Dioscorides in an 8th century copy, noted in the margin beside the entry for yarrow that in his experience the local variety grew in 2 distinct forms, one with white flowers and one with a pale pink, and that the white-flowered form seemed more efficacious for staunching wounds. This marginal note, made in a moment of practical observation, was incorporated into the next copy and the copy after that, and eventually the note found its way into the working text, was smoothed into the prose and is now an anonymous contribution to accumulated knowledge, indistinguishable from the ancient original. The most used book on this shelf, most used in the sense of most consulted, most worn, its cover darkest and its page edges most thumbed, is a composite volume compiled by a predecessor abbot who died 40 years ago and is now a candidate for beatification, his process of investigation proceeding slowly in the distant offices of Rome. He compiled this book over the course of 20 years, drawing on all the sources available to him and adding, in careful and precisely observed editions, the specific knowledge developed through the monastery's own centuries of practical healing. He describes the preparation of an infusion of elderflowers for fever in a passage of such practical clarity that you can almost smell the steam. He describes the application of a poultice of comfrey root for a broken limb, with an attention to the mechanics of both the preparation and the application, the exact consistency of the cooked root, the temperature at which it should be applied, the type of bandage material most suited to holding it in place. That tells you he had done this himself many times, and had noticed carefully what worked and what did not. The infirmary where these remedies were applied lies adjacent to the library, separated by one thick stone wall, accessible through a low door in the northeast corner of this room that is kept permanently locked from the library side, open from the infirmary side. The close relationship between the library and the infirmary was understood by the builders of this place as architectural logic. Knowledge and its application should be close to one another. The monk who needed to consult a source on the preparation of a medication should not have to cross a courtyard to do so. The door between these two rooms is a statement of philosophy pressed in oak and iron. What is written here is meant to be used there. The infirmary tonight houses 3 patients. An elderly monk with a congestion of the lungs that has kept him bedridden for 2 weeks and fills the infirmary corridor at night with the sound of slow, effortful breathing. A younger brother who fell from a ladder in the brewery last month and broke 2 ribs. He is healing well. The infirmarian notes with satisfaction, the bones knitting under their comfrey poultice with the straightforward efficiency of a young body whose primary business is still growth. And a converso, a lay brother, one of the men who live and work in the monastery without the full obligation of the choir office, who arrived 3 days ago with a wound to his left hand from a woodworking accident that showed the first signs of putrefaction, and who has been treated with a preparation of honey and thyme applied to the wound twice daily. The honey for its well-established ability to discourage the visible signs of corruption in flesh, the thyme for the sharp, clean, volatile oils that the monks have observed through long practical experience to assist in the same process. The knowledge that guides all of this treatment lives on this shelf. The books here are not beautiful, not in the way that the liturgical manuscripts are beautiful, not in the way that the illuminated pages are beautiful, but they have a different kind of beauty. The beauty of things made to work, things that have worked, things that embody the particular grace of human attention applied to the real and immediate problem of suffering. You take one of the smaller herbals from the shelf, a thin volume, its cover nearly black with handling, its pages soft as cloth from years of being opened and closed by hands that were often damp from working with plant preparations. The page it falls open to shows a drawing of a plant, the stalks and leaves indicated in confident brown ink. The root system drawn with particular care and detail, the flower head at the top simplified but recognizable, beside the drawing in a neat hand the name Lavandula vera, and below in smaller script a note in the margin added in a different ink, a slightly darker brown, perhaps 20 years after the original text, grown in good quantity near the south cloister wall, flowers best in the 3rd and 4th weeks of June, most efficacious when distilled in clean water immediately after harvest. The dried flower is useful but diminished. Someone stood in the garden in June and noticed and wrote it down. For you. For someone. At least, for some future reader, which tonight is you. There comes a point in any long, still evening, and this is that point when the mind stops moving forward and begins to move in a different direction, not backward exactly, and not deeper, though deepening is part of it. It begins to move in the direction of what the mystics of this tradition called contemplation, a mode of awareness that is different from thinking, different from imagining, that involves setting down the instrument of analysis and simply being in the presence of what is. You have been in this room long enough now that it has stopped feeling foreign. The cold of the stone floor has reached its equilibrium with your feet and is no longer cold but simply present, a neutral texture. The smell of beeswax and parchment has become the default smell, the smell that registers as air rather than as something distinguishable from air. The rain continues as it has continued, as it will continue, its white noise constancy now so familiar that its absence would be more noticeable than its presence. You have crossed the threshold from visitor to inhabitant, and with that crossing comes a kind of permission to think slowly, permission to think the kinds of thoughts that a busy, forward-moving life does not typically have space for. Think about time. Not as a practical matter, not in the sense of what time it is, what time you need to wake, how many hours remain. Think about time as a substance, as a medium, as the thing through which this room has travelled from its first moment of existence to this moment, which is both this rainy 12th century night and, impossibly, also the moment you are currently inhabiting, however many centuries separate them. The monk who laid the first stone of this floor could not have imagined this moment. He knew intellectually that his work would outlast him. He could not have known by how much or what form the outlasting would take, or that somewhere in an unimaginable future someone would stand on the stone he was laying and think about him with a feeling that is somewhere between gratitude and astonishment. He could not have known this, and yet he laid the stone carefully. He chose it for its solidity, its flat face, its freedom from obvious fracture lines. He set it in its bed of mortar with attention. He checked its level with a wooden straight edge and a plumb line. He worked as though permanence were possible, even though nothing in his experience guaranteed it. This is one of the most moving things about old buildings and old books and old-made things in general. The evidence they contain of people who worked as though permanence were possible. They could not know their work would survive. The buildings that did not survive, and there were many, the vast majority of medieval structures are gone, returned to earth, absorbed back into the landscape that produced them. Those buildings were built with the same care by people with the same intentions. The survival was partly luck, partly the quality of the materials, partly the accidents of history that spared one place and consumed another. The care was universal. The intention was universal. All of those builders in all of those places raised their walls as though what they were building mattered enough to build well. And sometimes, occasionally, contrarily, against all odds, it did last. This building lasted. These books lasted. Consider the books again, from this new angle. Each of the manuscripts in this room contains within it the residue of at least 3 kinds of time. First, the time of the ideas it contains, ideas thought and developed and refined over years or decades or centuries before anyone wrote them down, ideas that arrived at this room after journeys through multiple minds, multiple languages, multiple interpretations. Second, the time of its making, the hours and days and months of the specific scribe's specific life that went into the production of this specific copy, time made permanent in the form of strokes on a page. Third, the time of its survival, the decades and centuries that have passed since it was completed, the events it has witnessed in its passive, bookish, absolutely uncommitted way, fires in other buildings of the monastery, outbreaks of illness, invasions and retreats, the deaths of every abbot and every monk who has ever consulted it, the ordinary traffic of ordinary days uncountable in their number and unremarkable in their specifics, each one adding a small invisible layer to the accumulated atmosphere of the room. All 3 kinds of time coexist in every volume on these shelves. When you hold one of these books, you are holding all 3 kinds simultaneously, though only one of them is visible in the ordinary sense. The ideas are visible if you can read Latin. The making is visible in the individual quality of the script, the particular brushwork of the illuminations, the specific choices of binding and decoration that can be attributed to a place and a period, and sometimes even to an individual hand. But the time of survival is the one that is felt rather than seen, a quality of the object that registers in the hands and the nose, and some deeper sense that has no organ and no name, the sense that recognizes the simply old as somehow significant, that responds to centuries of accumulated time with a feeling that is part reverence and part melancholy, and part something without a single word in any language, though many languages have tried. The Latin word is perhaps the closest, gravitas, usually translated as gravity, seriousness, weight, but its root gravis heavy contains the right idea more precisely. These books are heavy in a way that exceeds their physical weight. They have accumulated something over their long lives that presses down gently on whoever holds them, not oppressively, not crushingly, but with the gentle, specific pressure of significance. You are holding something that mattered to people who are gone. You are the current custodian of a thing that will outlast you as it has outlasted everyone who touched it before you. This is one of the deep gifts of old places and old objects. They place you accurately in time. They remind you, not cruelly, not with any intention to diminish you, but simply as a fact of the encounter, that you are brief. You are a brief custodian. Your years in this world are a small number compared to the years these stones have been standing. Your name, if it is recorded anywhere at all, will be less legible in 3 centuries than the monk's name is now. You will be, in the long run, one of the anonymous majority, the vast population of careful hands and careful feet who passed through rooms like this one and left only the ghost of their passage in the wear on the stones and the oil on the shelves. And this, paradoxically, surprisingly, with a gentleness that is almost tender, this is a comfort. Because if you're brief, you are also free of the obligation to leave a monument, free of the pressure to make your passage matter in a way that will be legible to strangers centuries from now, free to be simply and completely here in this room on this night with the rain and the candles and the books, adding your own small anonymous layer to the accumulated presence of this place. Your breath, the air of this room, your weight, this stone floor, your attention given to these pages, these shelves, this moment. It is enough. It has always been enough. The scribe writing on the far side of this room does not know you exist. He cannot know. He is in the 12th century and you are wherever you are, whenever you are, which from his perspective is an impossibility as complete and unimaginable as the far side of the moon. The distance between him and you is not a distance that can be crossed by any means available to him. No road, no ship, no prayer travels that particular route from here to there. And yet, he is writing for you. Not for you personally, not with any specific image of you in his mind, not with any knowledge of the language you speak or the world you inhabit, or the particular shape of the life that brought you on this particular evening to seek out a quiet place like this one in which to rest. He could not have constructed you in his imagination even if he had tried. The details of your life being as alien to him as the details of his life, the cowl, the cold dormitory, the 7 daily offices, the quill and inkhorn might initially seem to you. The specific contours of one another's lives are mutually invisible across this distance. But he is writing for you. Because every act of writing is an act of addressing the future. Every scribe who dips a quill in ink and draws a stroke across a page is making a gesture that is fundamentally and irrevocably forward-directed. The words being made are words being left. The person making them knows or feels at some level below conscious articulation that the page will outlast the making, that the words will continue in their existence after the hand that wrote them has ceased. Writing is always a letter to someone you will never meet, posted into a future you cannot see, carried by a medium whose lifespan you can only imperfectly estimate. This is especially acutely true of the monks in a scriptorium. The monk copying a theological text is not, strictly speaking, adding new thoughts to the world. He is preserving existing ones. He is the link in the chain, the hand that takes the idea from the previous generation and passes it to the next. The careful intermediary whose task is not to originate but to transmit, faithfully, accurately, without corruption or loss. And yet this act of transmission is not a neutral or passive one. It is deeply and personally engaged. The scribe who copies a text over the course of a year develops a relationship with that text that is intimate in the way that only sustained, repeated, close attention can be intimate. He has moved through every word, every sentence, every argument. He has been in the presence of difficult passages long enough to understand them. He has copied passages of great beauty so many times that they live in his hands as well as in his mind, accessible in the muscle memory of his wrist and fingers, as well as in the lexicon of his conscious thought. And occasionally, in the margins, the white space at the edges of the page that the text does not reach, he leaves a trace of himself. The marginal note is one of the great unacknowledged literary forms of the medieval period. It is not a letter, not an essay, not a poem. It is a conversation, an aside, the monk turning from the text he is copying to address, for a moment, the next reader. These asides range from the deeply personal to the amusingly mundane. In the margin of a manuscript copied in an Irish monastery in the 9th century, a scribe wrote, "The page is holy, the pen is merry. My bright-eyed little cat is a wonderful thing. He was tired, he was cold, probably." He had been copying dense theological prose for weeks. And he looked up and saw his cat, the monastery cats being kept for the entirely practical purpose of controlling the mice that would otherwise destroy the manuscripts, and the sight of the cat, bright-eyed and oblivious, filled him with an uncomplicated happiness that he felt the need to record immediately in the margin of the sacred page he was making, because not to record it would have been to let it pass without acknowledgement, and to let it pass without acknowledgement would have been wasteful. He wrote it for you. He wrote it knowing that someone would eventually read it, not knowing who or when, confident only that the someone would be a person with a category called cat, with access to the feeling of uncomplicated happiness in the presence of an animal, with the capacity to read that note and smile 3 months or 3 centuries later in the way that he smiled writing it. He was right. People have been smiling at that note for over 1,000 years. In this library, in this room, there are marginal notes left by perhaps a dozen different hands over the past 3 centuries. They are small, most of them a word, a cross-reference, a date marking when the book was last consulted, a question mark drawn beside a passage whose meaning was unclear, but there are larger ones too. In the back pages of the herbal, the blank leaves at the end of the volume where the text does not reach, a monk who was presumably stationed here in the last generation of the previous century has written a paragraph in a hand quite different from the careful book hand of the main text, a looser, more personal script, written faster, the letters slightly uneven as though the writer was not seated at a proper writing desk, but was perhaps in the garden itself, writing on his knee, surrounded by the plants he was describing. He describes a morning in early May when the lavender was just beginning to bud, when the bees were working the garden with a focused industry that he found both calming and instructive, when the light on the stone wall of the church had the particular clear quality that only comes in the first weeks of spring when the air is still clean from winter, and the sun is at an angle that will not return until September. He describes these things in a Latin that is warm and slightly irregular, the Latin of someone who thinks primarily in Latin rather than translating from a native tongue, and therefore a Latin that has the ease and the personal quality of a natural language in natural use, rather than a learned one being carefully deployed. He wrote this, he says at the end of the paragraph, because he wanted to remember, because the morning was perfect and he knew, even as he was in it, that it would not last. Not because anything would go wrong, but simply because mornings end, because May becomes June, becomes autumn, becomes winter, because nothing stays. Then the only response he could think of to the fragility of a perfect morning was to write it down, to send it forward, to find the act of writing, way of holding the irreversible in something less temporary than memory. He found it. You are reading it now, centuries later, the candlelight of a rainy night, and the morning he described is as present as this rain, real as these candles, close as the space between your eyes and this page. The May morning found you. All of those carefully written down things found their way. Eventually, someone who needed them. Let us think, for a while, about the people who built this place. Not the monks, though we have spent time with them and will carry them with us. The monks came after. The monks were the purpose of this building, its residents and users, the people for whom it was built. But before them, before the first monk entered the first doorway and set down his bundle of possessions and looked around at the stone walls and the empty shelves, with the feeling of having arrived at the place he was meant to be before all of that, there were other people. Quarrymen. They are never mentioned by name in the monastery's records. They appear in the account rolls as a group, pro lapicidis for the stonecutters, a sum of money recorded against a date, the transaction complete, the workers nameless. But the stone they cut is here. Every stone in this building passed through their hands, was broken from the living rock of the hillside by their iron wedges and wooden mallets, was shaped by their chisels into the approximate forms required, was lifted and loaded onto carts and driven to the building site. Their hands were on these stones before the mortar was laid, before the walls rose, before any idea of a library existed anywhere but in the mind of the abbot who commissioned the project and the master builder who drew the first chalk lines on the ground to indicate where the foundations would be dug. There is a hill not far from here, a 10-minute walk in summer, perhaps 20 in winter, the path being unpaved and prone to mud. On the south face of this hill, at a height that required scaffolding to reach safely, there is a quarry face. You cannot see it from the monastery, but it is there, and if you were to stand before it, you would see the evidence of those nameless quarrymen's work preserved in the rock. The channels cut by their wedges, the flat, smoothed surfaces where the dressed stone was taken, the occasional small niche cut into the rock face where a tool was set down and picked up again so many times that the stone remembers the shape of its handle. These marks are older than any book in this library. They are the first marks made in the service of this building, the beginning of the chain of effort and intention and skill that ends here, in these walls, in these shelves, in this candlelit room where you are resting. Think of the carters who hauled the stone. Their oxen were enormous, patient animals, broader and heavier than modern dairy cattle, bred specifically for the sustained effort of pulling heavy loads over bad roads without complaint. The carts were wide, low, their wheels iron-rimmed, their axles turned from green oak that would shrink and season under load, the shrinkage periodically causing a wheel to wobble and requiring the driver to stop and adjust. The road between the quarry and the building site would have been worn into a deep rutted track by the end of the project, a scar on the landscape that would have remained visible for decades. The carters knew every rut by its position and its season, the ones that were worst in spring thaw, the ones that dried to mere inconvenience by midsummer, the one near the third gate that had swallowed a wheel completely during the second winter of construction, and had required 4 men and 2 spare oxen to retrieve. These are the kinds of knowledge that leave no record. Practical, specific, embodied knowledge, the knowledge of people whose hands and bodies were the instruments of their work, does not typically find its way into the account rolls or the chronicle that the monastery keeps of its history. The chronicle records the foundation date, the names of the abbots, the significant donations of land and money, the deaths of notable members of the community, the occasional extraordinary event, a fire, a flood, a visit from a bishop or a king. It does not record the name of the ox cart driver who developed a specific technique for navigating the bad rut near the third gate, the quarryman who discovered that the limestone 20 feet further into the hillside was more consistently free of fracture lines than the face they had been working. These people are gone as completely as it is possible for a person to be gone. And yet their work is here. Their work is the walls of this room, the floor beneath your feet, the vault above your head. Every time a winter passes over this building and it does not fall, every time a storm drives rain against its walls and the walls hold, every time a human being sits in this room and reads by candlelight and feels safe and warm and surrounded by the accumulated thought of centuries, every time any of this happens, those nameless quarrymen and carters and masons are keeping their agreement. The agreement they made with the future without knowing it. We will do this work carefully enough that it lasts, and its lasting will be our legacy, even though we will not be named in it. The masons are the ones whose work is most permanently and visibly here. They were travelling craftsmen. The building trades worked this way in this period, skilled artisans moving from project to project across a region, their expertise in demand wherever a church or a castle or a monastery was being built or extended. A master mason might work on 3 or 4 significant buildings in a career. This library, a cathedral 2 days' ride north, a fortified manor house in the lowlands, a hospital built in the name of a repentant lord who had done something terrible during the wars and was attempting through construction to balance the account. His mark is here. The mason's mark, a small incised symbol cut into a prominent stone as a signature, a record of payment, a way of identifying which stones each mason had worked so that wages could be calculated accurately. These marks were unique to each craftsman, simple geometric forms, a cross with one arm extended, a V with a small square above it, a circle bisected by a diagonal line, and they were consistent across all the work of that mason's career. The same mark appearing in this building and in the cathedral 2 days to the north, and in every building this man ever worked on, a thread connecting distant projects through the single life that moved between them. Look at the corbel nearest the reading table, the one that supports the beginning of the vault rib. On its underside, in the shadow where the stone meets the wall, there is a mark. It is small, you would not see it if you were not looking for it. But look, a simple shape, 4 lines, an asymmetrical cross, cut lightly but cleanly into the dressed face of the stone. The mason who cut it was perhaps 30 years old when this building was under construction. He had probably already cut the same mark into a dozen other stones in a dozen other buildings. He would cut it into dozens more before his career ended. He did not know this stone would be here. This library, this specific room, the stone now dark with age and candle smoke, the mark still sharp in its protected shadow. He did not know you would be looking at it. He cut it anyway, because it was his mark, and the stone was his work, and his work was worth signing. The question of survival is one that this room poses simply by existing. Most things do not survive. This is the overwhelming, numerically dominant fact about human-made objects and human-generated ideas. They perish. The buildings fall, consumed by fire or dissolution or the slow reclamation of the earth that tolerates human constructions only for a while before taking them back. The books rot, their parchment deliquescing in damp, their inks fading, their covers warped and split by cycles of wetting and drying, their texts lost when the last copy is destroyed and no one makes another. The songs go silent when the last person who knew them dies, and after a generation no one remembers that there was a song. The techniques of craftsmen, the specific angle at which to hold the graver for a certain effect in metalwork, the exact temperature at which a particular glaze achieves its specific quality, these die with the craftsmen who carry them if no student is paying close enough attention. This room, these books, these stones, they are the exceptions. Why do some things survive? The first reason is physical, the quality of the materials and the craftsmanship with which they were made. The parchment in this library is good parchment made from the skins of young, healthy animals prepared with care, dried and scraped to an even thickness, free from the weak spots and irregularities that would cause it to split and crumble under the stress of centuries. The inks are gall, inks of good quality, properly prepared, penetrating the parchment fibres rather than merely sitting on the surface. The leather of the bindings was treated with oak bark tannins that have preserved its suppleness to a degree that tallow-cured leather could not have achieved. The stones of the walls were quarried from a consistent, fine-grained limestone that resists the freeze-thaw cycles of winter without spalling. The mortar between them was properly mixed, properly cured, properly maintained. Quality is the first condition of survival. The second reason is institutional. The monastery as a structure of care. Books do not survive on their own. They require custodians. They require people who understand their value and take active steps to protect them, who repair damaged bindings before the damage spreads, who store the volumes in conditions that minimize humidity fluctuation and exposure to light, who recopy deteriorating texts before the source becomes illegible, who maintain the building that houses them through the ongoing minor repairs that prevent major structural failures. The monastery is a machine for this kind of sustained institutional care. Its permanence, or relative permanence, monasteries too were vulnerable to fire and dissolution. The wars and political upheavals that swept away institutions as readily as they swept away individual lives. Its relative permanence allowed the accumulation and maintenance of knowledge over timescales impossible to individual human lives. The third reason is the one that is hardest to name but most important to understand. These things survived because people believed they mattered. Belief, here, is not a soft or vague thing. It is a practical force. The monk who spent 30 years in this scriptorium copying manuscripts believed, with a conviction that shaped every hour of his working life, that the words he was copying were worth copying, worth the 30 years, worth the strained eyes and the stiff wrists and the cold winters when the ink froze in the inkhorn before terse. He believed this not in the abstract but concretely, specifically in the particular text he was working on at any given moment. The commentary he was copying was important because it explained something true about something that mattered enormously. and if it were lost, that truth would be less accessible, and that mattered. And so the copying mattered, and so the 30 years mattered. And so the strain on the eyes and the wrists was not a cost but a form of devotion. When people believe their work matters enough, they do it well enough that it lasts. This is the mystery and the gift of this room and all rooms like it. They are the accumulated product of people who believed that what they were making and preserving was worth the making and the preservation. The buildings, the books, the illuminations, the marginal notes, the mason's marks, all of it arising from the same deep conviction that what is worth doing well enough to last, that the future is real enough to build for, that the people who will come after us are real enough to write for. And the future did come. The future came, and it found what was left for it, and held it carefully, and passed it on. You are one of those futures. You are the recipient of that long chain of careful custody. And what do you feel, being here? There is a kind of gratitude, perhaps, the particular gratitude of someone who receives a gift they did not know they needed until they received it. You did not know before you stepped through the doorway of this imagined room exactly what you were missing. But now that you have been here, in the candlelight, in the sound of rain, among the shelves of carefully made and carefully kept books, in the silence between the offices and after the midnight bell, you know, you have been given an experience of continuity that the fragmented, rapidly changing surface of ordinary life rarely provides. You have been shown that the past is not merely past, that it exists still in the things it made, that those things are available to anyone willing to be still enough and quiet enough to receive them. The books are not closed off from you by the centuries that separate you from their making. If anything, the centuries have made them more available, not less. Because time has done the work of distillation, has removed the noise and the contingency and the ordinary daily commerce of the lives in which they were made, and left only what proved durable. What you find in this room is what survived the full passage of time, which means it is what was strong enough to survive, what was worth surviving. Look at the shelves one more time. Each volume is a decision made by someone who is gone, a decision about what to copy, what to keep, what to bind in good leather with good boards and label clearly so that it could be found again. Each decision was made in the light of values, what is worth knowing, what is worth preserving, what the future will need, and each decision made in uncertainty has been ratified by the simple fact that the future arrived and found the preserved things useful and beautiful and good. Tonight, the future is you. And you are here. And the room is glad. The candles are growing lower now. You have been here a long time, and the candles have been burning with you through all of it, keeping their faithful amber watch, shrinking degree by degree with the patience of things that know their purpose and perform it without complaint. If you look at the candle nearest you, the one in the iron floor stand at the end of the centre shelf row, you can see the difference from when the evening began. What was then a full, fat column of beeswax is now a shorter, slightly tilted pillar. The wax, having run and pooled and resolidified in the shallow dish of the hold, each small river of cooling wax recording in its shape the particular currents of air that were moving in this room at the moment it ran. The flame itself is slightly larger now relative to the remaining candle, a larger flame on a shorter stub, the proportion shifting as the candle diminishes, so that what was once a modest flame tending a tall candle has become in some sense the dominant element, the fire outlasting the fuel, the light outlasting the substance that carries it. This is not an unhappy metaphor. Let the thought come and then let it go. That is what this room is for. In this hour, the slow, easy arising and dissolving of thoughts, none of them forced, none of them held too tightly, each one given space to arrive and to depart without making demands. The mind at this hour is like the rain outside, continuous but gentle, present but not urgent, filling the available space without straining against its limits. The candle at the reading table, the one nearest where Brother Edmund was working before he left for Vigils, has burned down to within an inch of its base. It will not last the night. Within the next hour it will reach the point where the flame begins to gutter and flatten against the pooled wax, where the light it produces becomes very small and very intimate, a tiny presence rather than a working light, a symbol more than a source, then it will go out. Not dramatically. No final gasp, no sudden darkness the way dramatic portrayals of candle extinction tend to suggest. It will simply gradually diminish, the flame will shorten, the heat will lose its contest with the cooling wax, the light will fail, slowly, like an eye closing. And the room will be slightly darker for it. Not dark, the other candles will hold their light for some time yet, but darker by one. And that one's loss will be felt in the way that the loss of any quiet presence is felt, not with grief, not with drama, but with the small, quiet noting that something warm has moved on. Let your eyes grow heavier with the candle. This is the right direction. This is the direction this room has been pointing you in for the entirety of this long amber evening. The room was never asking you to be alert. It was never asking you to analyze or decide or understand. It was asking only that you be present, and you have been present, and now the presence is doing what presences do at the end of a long and gentle evening. It is softening at the edges. The outlines of the shelves are less sharp than they were an hour ago, not because the light has changed significantly, but because your eyes are receiving it differently, your nervous system gently down-regulating from the slight heightened attention of arrival to something much quieter and lower, something closer to the threshold of sleep. The rain is the same. It has not changed. It has been falling since before you arrived and will be falling after you go, and in this permanence is something profoundly restful. You do not need to attend to the rain, you do not need to listen to it or track it or wait for it to finish. It simply falls and it will keep falling, and your only relationship to it is to be here while it falls, and that relationship requires nothing of you at all. The books are the same. They have been on these shelves for decades, for centuries in some cases, and they will be here tomorrow and next week and next year, and they do not require your attention to continue existing. They have existed perfectly well without you for all the years before you came here, and they will do so again after you leave, and this self-sufficiency of theirs is not indifference, but a kind of gift. They free you from obligation. You do not owe them anything except perhaps this: the brief acknowledgement of their beauty, the brief gratitude for their existence which you have offered, and which is enough. The stone floor is the same. Cool through your feet, smooth, patient, carrying the weight of everyone who ever stood on it, with the same equanimity with which it will carry the weight of everyone who will stand on it in all the years to come. The floor does not know you are here, and this too is a gift. To be in a room that does not know you are there, that is not watching, not assessing, not responding to your presence, is to be given a rare privacy, a space in which you can simply be what you are without the slight performance that the presence of an observing consciousness always induces. Be what you are. You are a person who needed a quiet place. You found one. The stone is under your feet, and the vault is over your head, and the shelves are on every side, and the rain is at every window, and the candles are burning lower, lower, their light growing warmer and smaller and more intimate with each passing quarter hour. And the room is drawing in around you like a blanket drawn up to the chin, not confining, the opposite of confining, encompassing, holding, the way warmth holds you from the outside when you have been cold for a long time and have finally found the fire. The fire. The candle flame is the fire. All 12 of them, though by now perhaps 11, perhaps the smallest, the one in the far sconce near the entrance, has reached its end and gone out, leaving that corner slightly deeper in shadow, slightly quieter in its light, small area of greater rest amid the general gentleness. 11 flames. Each one a small, faithful, living thing. Each one burning with the complete commitment that fire brings to everything it does, not metaphorically but literally. The flame is entire in its attention. The flame is a single-pointed, pure, undistracted presence that has no existence except in the act of burning, that is nothing except this moment of heat and light, that knows nothing except the here and the now and the next fraction of a second in which it will continue. There is something to learn from the candle. Not now. Now is not for learning. Now is for resting in the same room as the candle's lesson, letting it exist in the periphery of awareness. Not grasped, not analyzed, simply present alongside you as you grow quieter and the room grows quieter and the rain continues its ancient, tireless, deeply patient conversation with the stone. There is a last kind of seeing that happens at the very edge of sleep. It is not quite voluntary, you cannot make it happen by trying, and trying is precisely the wrong approach to it. It comes when the analytical mind has released its grip, when the quiet has been long enough and deep enough that the part of you which watches and categorizes and names has grown tired of its own activity and laid itself down, and what remains is something softer, a receptive awareness, open rather than directed, taking in the room not as a collection of objects to be identified and understood, but as a continuous experience of color and texture and sound. This is that kind of seeing. The shelves in the eyes that are slowly losing their focus on the near edge of sleep are not shelves anymore. They are verticals of warmth and shadow, amber and brown, and the deep near black of unlit spaces, layered and stacked and beautiful in the way that abstract things are beautiful when the mind is not insisting on their meaning. The books on the shelves are rectangles and wedges of colour, the pale cream of exposed parchment at the four edges, the dark warm brown of leather covers, the occasional glimpse of a pale label. Together they form a pattern that is entirely regular in its rhythm. Shelf books, shelf, and entirely irregular in its specifics. Each book a slightly different width and height from its neighbour, each cluster along the shelf a different configuration of thick and thin, tall and short, creating the kind of orderly variety that the eye and the mind find equally restful. The vault above is barely visible now. The candles have burned lower still in these last quiet minutes, and the ceiling, that high generous vault with its stone ribs and carved bosses and centuries of accumulated candle smoke, has retreated into a soft general darkness that is no longer architectural but simply present, darkness that is not empty but full, a darkness that contains the room as the night sky contains the stars, as the depth of the sea contains its There is perhaps one more candle that has gone out in the past little while. The reading table is noticeably dimmer now. That area of the room where Brother Edmund worked all evening, now receiving only the borrowed light from the wall, sconces on either side, and the borrowed light is softer, gentler, less defined than the direct flame of a candle placed on the working surface. The table has stopped being a working surface. It has become simply a horizontal plane of wood in the amber and shadow room. Its careful arrangement of inks and pens and the unfinished calendar page all still exactly as it was left, waiting with the patience of objects for the morning's return. Outside, the rain continues. It has perhaps grown slightly quieter in the last hour, the first rush of the evening storm spending itself gradually, the clouds giving what they have to give, the intensity settling toward the long, steady, gentle rain that will continue through the remaining hours of the night and into the first grey softening of the pre-dawn. The gargoyles are still pouring, but more quietly now, the water in the drainage channels still running but less urgent, the general conversation of the rain against the stone still present but lower, a murmur rather than a voice, a breath rather than a speech. The rain is going to sleep too. Not fully, the rain will not stop tonight, but it is entering its resting phase, long, steady middle period, the rain's equivalent of the deep hours of sleep where the body does its quiet work of repair and integration, where nothing dramatic occurs and nothing dramatic is needed, where simply continuing is the entire task. You are entering the same phase. Your breath is slow. The chest lifts barely, a small, regular, unhurried rising out. The chest settles, a pause in which the body holds what it has received, a brief rest at the bottom of the exhale, then in again. The rhythm is the oldest rhythm your body knows, older than language, older than memory, the rhythm it was doing before you were conscious and will continue after consciousness lapses into sleep. The stones of the floor are still cool and still present. The books are still on their shelves, waiting, patient, not waiting for anything in particular, simply existing in the way that very old things exist without urgency, without the orientation toward the future that living things carry, simply being what they are in the present moment, fully, without reservation. The carved face on the vault boss, the serene bearded face looking down from the highest point of the room with its expression of settled and unassuming peace, is invisible now, the vault too dark for it to be seen, but it is there. It has been there for 3 centuries, looking down at the room in the same expression regardless of who was in it or what was happening, regardless of candles burning or candles dying, regardless of rain or sunlight, regardless of any of the 1,000 ordinary and extraordinary events that have occurred in this room over its long life. The face does not change, the expression does not change. The peace it expresses is not the peace of someone who has resolved all difficulties, but the peace of someone who has come to understand that the difficulties and the peace exist at different levels, that the surface of life can be troubled without disturbing the deep, still place from which the face looks down. That deep, still place. You are approaching it. Not forcing, simply approaching, the way a boat approaches a shore it has been moving toward for a long time. The momentum of the journey doing most of the work, the shore rising gradually from the horizon, growing larger and more specific, until the keel touches sand and the rocking motion of the water ceases and the stillness of arrival settles over everything like a benediction. The candles. Let us count what remains. Perhaps 7 now, or 8, the exact number beyond precision, as the room becomes a single continuous ambience rather than a collection of separate light sources. The individual flames have merged in the way that music merges when you stop hearing the individual instruments and begin hearing the piece. The light of this room at this hour is simply this: warm, amber, very slightly moving, not quite enough to read by, exactly enough to rest in. This is the light your eyes close in. Not an imposed darkness, not the abrupt extinguishing of all light. Simply the natural dimming of a room in its late hours, the candles completing their work, the night completing its arc, the rain and the stone and the vault and the books and the old bearded face in the highest darkness, all settling into their nighttime configurations, their patient, enduring, present, ordinary, extraordinary selves. The monastery is quiet. The monks have returned from their night office and lie in their cells again, some of them already asleep, 1 or 2 lying awake in the familiar, almost pleasant wakefulness of the hours between vigils and lauds, awake but resting, the mind moving slowly over remembered psalms or the day's unfinished thoughts, or nothing in particular, just the warm, dark, breath-paced quiet of a life that has been organized around this very moment, this very quality of being, this deepening into the self that the night makes possible. The library holds its books. The books hold their words. The words hold their worlds, all those voices, those hands, those careful mornings and long afternoons and rainy evenings of making and preserving and passing on. Everything is held. Everything is here. And you are held too in the amber light. The rain's murmur, the stone's patience, the vault's gentle dark, then the room's long and generous embrace. Let your eyes close the rest of the way. The candle nearest you has found its final inch of wax. Its flame very small now, very warm, very close to the surface, a flame that is almost a light rather than a fire. Glow more than a flame, whisper more than a word. It holds for you. It holds as long as you need it to, and then softly, without announcement, without a final flicker or a dramatic guttering, simply and completely and without fuss, it rests. And the room keeps it safe. And the rain keeps falling. And you are asleep. Welcome to Sleepy History with Henry. Here, we harness AI to breathe new life into authentic historical records, creating an immersive auditory experience. This entire production is AI-assisted, crafted solely for relaxation and sleep support. Tand is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, let Henry and AI guide you on a peaceful journey through the past.